The Hershey family is one of America's richest, with a $17.4 billion fortune. But you won't find the Hershey name on a mansion or a super yacht. The founder, Milton S. Hershey, left his empire to a different kind of family. The thousands of poor children at his boarding school. For nearly a century, this intended family has been controlled by another, the small group of powerful guardians who manage the money. That guardianship has become a brutal, decades-long power struggle against the very children they were sworn to protect. From failure to the Chocolate King. Before he was the Chocolate King, Milton S. Hershey was a failure. Before he built a utopian town, he was homeless. And before he became a father to thousands of orphans, he was the abandoned son of a drunkard. The sanitized bronze statues don't tell you this. The entire Hershey empire wasn't built on success. It was built on a wound. Hershey was not born to privilege. He was forged in failure, religious austerity, and the shadow of a deeply unreliable father. Born in 1857 in rural Pennsylvania, he was the son of Henry Hershey, a man who represented everything the devout insular Mennonite community of Lancaster County disdained. Henry was a dreamer, a speculator, and a chronic failure. He chased phantom agricultural trends from cough drop ingredients to nursery plants, dragging his wife Fanny and young Milton across the country in pursuit of schemes that invariably collapsed. Fanny Hershey, in stark contrast, was the embodiment of Mennonite piety, stern, practical, and deeply disillusioned with her husband. Biographers like Michael D'Antonio paint a portrait of a fractured home. Henry was a frequent absentee, often described as a philanderer and possibly an alcoholic who left his family in poverty. This constant upheaval destroyed Milton's education. He was pulled in and out of so many different local schools that by the time his mother finally put her foot down and settled back in Pennsylvania, he had only achieved a fourth-grade education. This lack of formal schooling would become a defining feature of his life, a source of lifelong insecurity. The relationship between his parents defined his worldview. From his mother, he inherited a rigid sense of thrift and an unyielding work ethic. From his father, he inherited a grand, ambitious vision, but also a deep-seated terror of failure and debt. This terror was well earned. After his brief schooling, Milton was apprenticed to a local printer, a job he despised and was quickly fired from. His mother then secured him an apprenticeship with a confectioner in Lancaster in 1872. It was here, working with boiled sugar and molasses, that he found his calling. But success was not immediate. In 1876, with $100 borrowed from his mother's sister, Hershey moved to Philadelphia to start his first candy business. It was a catastrophic failure. For 6 grueling years, he worked himself to the bone, sleeping under his own counter, but he could never get ahead. The market was saturated, and he lacked the capital to compete. He was forced into bankruptcy. The experience was humiliating. He followed his feckless father to Denver, where he worked for a candy maker and learned a crucial secret: the stabilizing power of fresh milk in making superior caramel. He tried again in Chicago, failed again. He tried in New York City and failed yet again. This time so badly, he was reportedly seen wading into the East River in a moment of suicidal despair. By 1886, he was a 29-year-old man who had failed in 3 major American cities. He returned to Lancaster in utter disgrace, a reflection of the very father he had tried so hard not to become. It was in Lancaster that he made his final stand. He founded the Lancaster Caramel Company, using the fresh milk recipe he had learned in Denver. This time, it worked. An English importer, struck by the quality of his Crystal Lake caramels, placed a massive order. Suddenly, Milton Hershey was a success. By the 1890s, he was one of the wealthiest men in Lancaster, but the scars of his dark ages in Philadelphia and New York never left him. When Milton Hershey sold his Lancaster Caramel Company for the astonishing sum of $1 million in 1900, he was already a wealthy man. He could have retired, content as a regional success story. But the caramel business, he famously remarked, was just a fad. He believed the future was in chocolate. He retained the rights to his chocolate-making division and embarked on one of the most ambitious industrial projects of the Gilded Age. His decision-making process revealed a man who was equal parts visionary, obsessive controller, and traumatized child. He could have built his new factory in Philadelphia, New York, or Chicago, the centers of American commerce. Instead, he returned to the rolling farmland of his birth near Derry Township, Pennsylvania. This was not a sentimental choice. It was a strategic one. He was purchasing his entire supply chain. By positioning his factory in the heart of Pennsylvania's dairy belt, he was securing a limitless, cheap, and fresh supply of the one ingredient he believed made his chocolate superior: milk. He bought farm after farm, thousands of acres, creating a buffer of land that would be his and his alone. On this land, he would not just manufacture a product, he would manufacture a society. This was the birth of Hershey, Pennsylvania, the utopian dream. In an era defined by the squalor of tenements, the brutality of the Carnegie steel mills, and the bloody labor wars of the coal fields, Hershey envisioned a different kind of industrialism. His model was one of benevolent paternalism. He believed that if you provided workers with a clean, healthy, moral environment, they would be happy, loyal, and above all, productive. The town he built was unlike any other company town in America. He mandated that his workers' homes be single-family brick houses with lawns, indoor plumbing, electricity, and central heating, luxuries far beyond the reach of the average industrial worker. He built wide paved streets lined with trees, a public trolley system, a community center, a bank, a laundry, a department store, where prices were kept reasonable, but all profits flowed back to Hershey, and a zoo. He built the Hershey Theater, a palatial venue for entertainment, determined to bring high culture to his workers. And most famously, he built Hershey Park, which began in 1906 as a simple picnic area for his employees before ballooning with his ambition. Crucially, it was all his. The workers lived in Hershey's houses, walked on Hershey's streets, bought food at Hershey's store, deposited their paychecks in Hershey's bank, and relaxed in Hershey's Park. Their wages, paid by Hershey, flowed in a perfect circle back to Hershey. It was a closed economic loop, a benevolent feudalism built on milk chocolate. This absolute control extended to the factory floor, which was a marvel of modern efficiency. He designed it in an E-shape to ensure every workstation had a window for natural light. He installed advanced ventilation systems and immaculate tiled locker rooms with showers. But this came with a rigid moral code. He ran a strictly open shop, meaning unions were aggressively forbidden. He paid decent wages, believing the town's amenities were a core part of compensation. While he built his utopia, his business strategy was ruthlessly expansionist. The Hershey Bar, 1900, was his foundation, the first mass-produced, nationally affordable chocolate bar. He had repositioned chocolate from a luxury European delicacy to an everyday American staple. The product line grew rapidly. In 1907, the company introduced Hershey's Kisses. In 1921, it began adding the iconic plume, a small paper flag that was a brilliant stroke of anti-counterfeit branding. Mr. Goodbar followed in 1925, and Hershey's syrup in 1926. Hershey's vertical integration was relentless. He had secured his milk. Next, he went after sugar. In 1916, as World War I disrupted global supply chains, Hershey bought vast tracts of sugarcane plantation land in Cuba. He built Central Hershey, another complete company town, this one in the tropics. He was now his own supplier for his two most critical ingredients. This dual kingdom strategy, one in Pennsylvania for milk, one in Cuba for sugar, made him impervious to market shocks that crippled his competitors. The dark side of the Orphan Trust. His newfound business wealth allowed Milton Hershey to marry. In 1898, at the age of 41, he wed Catherine Kitty Sweeney. She was 26, a vibrant, beautiful, and witty Irish Catholic from Jamestown, New York. Their union was, by all accounts, one of deep affection, but it was also defined by two central tragedies. The first was their inability to have children. They desperately wanted an heir, but it never happened. The second tragedy was Kitty's health. Not long into their marriage, she began to suffer from a progressive nervous ailment, a vague diagnosis for what was likely a debilitating neurological or muscular disease. This childlessness is the pivot upon which the entire Hershey legacy turns. But like his father's past, Kitty's illness is also shrouded in controversy. Michael D'Antonio's 2006 biography, Hershey, Milton S. Hershey's Extraordinary Life of Wealth, Empire, and Utopian Idealism, sent shockwaves through the sanitized corporate history by addressing rumors that had long been whispered in Hershey, Pennsylvania. The book explores the unsettling possibility that Kitty's wasting disease was not a random affliction, but rather the devastating tertiary stage of syphilis. D'Antonio speculates, though cannot prove, that Milton Hershey may have contracted the disease during his desperate, itinerant years in New York or Chicago and passed it to his wife. This unproven but plausible allegation recasts the central tragedy of Hershey's life. It suggests his inability to have an heir might have been a direct consequence of his own past, and that his subsequent, almost manic devotion to charity was a form of profound personal atonement. Kitty's slow, painful decline and her death in 1915 solidified Milton's next act. Unable to father his own children, he would father thousands. In 1909, years before Kitty's death, they jointly established the Hershey Industrial School. He endowed it with 486 acres of prime farmland, intending it as a home for poor, healthy, white, male orphans. This act of charity, however, was rooted in the harsh pragmatism of the 19th century, not the soft altruism of the 21st. The school's founding document, the Deed of Trust, contained a clause that is unthinkable today. It was an indenture. Mothers, usually impoverished widows, who brought their sons to the school were forced to sign a legal document that transferred full legal guardianship of their child to Milton Hershey and the school's managers. They gave up all rights to their sons until the boys turned 18, and in some cases, 21. This was not just charity, it was a labor contract. The school was designed as a working farm. The orphan boys, as they were called, worked the fields and dairies around the school, farms modeled on the ones that fed Hershey's chocolate vision. The racial and gender restrictions were equally stark and revealing of the era's prejudices. The 1909 Deed of Trust was explicit. Only white boys were eligible. This clause, written by Hershey himself, was not an oversight. It was a deliberate policy that would legally bind the school for more than half a century. It was not until 1968, under immense pressure from the civil rights movement and facing a landmark lawsuit, that the trust petitioned the Dauphin County Orphans Court to finally remove the white restriction. The school remained all male for even longer, only beginning to admit girls in 1977 after further legal and social pressure. The final and most dramatic act of Hershey's life came in 1918, 3 years after Kitty's death. Still childless and now a widower, Hershey decided to finalize his legacy. In total secrecy, he met with his lawyer and quietly transferred his entire personal fortune, the vast majority of his controlling stock in the Hershey Chocolate Company, valued at the time at $60 million, into the Hershey Trust for the benefit of his school. It was an act of staggering magnitude. The public knew nothing. His closest executives knew nothing. The world believed Hershey was still the sole owner of his chocolate empire. The secret was not revealed until 1923, when a New York Times story exposed the transaction. The revelation was a bombshell. Milton Hershey had, in a single pen stroke, made a small school for orphan boys the controlling shareholder of one of America's largest corporations. He had ensured his legacy, but he had also created a monolithic, bizarre, and unaccountable power structure, a perpetual trust that would become, as one critic later termed it, a kingdom unto itself, ruled by the dead hand of its founder. This structure meant that the company's financial success was inextricably linked to the welfare of children. And it is here that the Hershey paradox becomes a dark and profound hypocrisy. The first layer was local. The orphan boys at the Hershey Industrial School were not just students, they were a labor force. The indenture contracts their mothers signed were not a formality. From a young age, the boys were expected to work on the school's massive farms and in its state-of-the-art dairies. They milked the cows, tended the fields, and processed the milk that was piped directly to the chocolate factory. In Hershey's mind, this was character building, an inoculation against the idleness that he believed had ruined his father. To a modern observer, it was a system of institutionalized, unpaid child labor, servicing the supply chain of a billion-dollar corporation. But this local exploitation paled in comparison to the second global layer. Hershey's third critical ingredient was the cocoa bean, and this he did not control. Like his competitors Nestlé and Mars, Hershey became reliant on the burgeoning cocoa plantations of West Africa, primarily the Ivory Coast and Ghana. By the late 20th century, a horrifying secret was emerging from these cocoa fields. They were run in significant part by children, many of them trafficked or sold into forced labor. Numerous investigations by journalists and human rights organizations, culminating in the 2001 Harkin-Engel Protocol, exposed a brutal reality. Children as young as 10 were being smuggled across borders, forced to work long hours, with dangerous tools like machetes, and denied education. For the Hershey Company, the hypocrisy was staggering. This was not just a corporation. This was a corporation owned by a children's charity. The $17.4 billion Hershey Trust faced growing scrutiny over its cocoa supply chain. Lawsuits were filed, including the landmark Doe versus Nestlé case, accusing major chocolate makers, Hershey among them, of turning a blind eye to forced child labor, though the courts never found them legally responsible. For decades, the company responded with pledges of reform, but as late as the 2020s, reports confirmed the problem remained endemic. This moral rot was mirrored by a deep-seated legal and financial vulnerability. The very structure Milton Hershey had created to protect his school, giving it total ownership of the company, was a ticking time bomb. The Hershey Trust, as the controlling shareholder, held almost its entire endowment in a single asset, Hershey Company stock. This violated the most fundamental principle of modern financial management, diversification, the prudent investor rule, a legal standard governing fiduciaries, demands that a trust manager protect the trust's assets by spreading investments across various sectors to mitigate risk. The Hershey Trust did the opposite. It bet everything year after year on the public's appetite for chocolate. As a 2008 analysis from the Columbia Law Review devastatingly pointed out, to financial critics, this failure to diversify looked reckless, a textbook example of what fiduciary duty is meant to prevent. The review calculated that this singular, stubborn focus on Hershey stock had cost the trust an estimated $2.7 billion in lost investment opportunities. The irony was that the trust was so staggeringly wealthy, $17.4 billion, that this loss was almost invisible. The company had been so successful that the dividends kept flowing, masking the underlying rot. The trust was a giant sitting on a mountain of gold, unaware that the mountain itself was structurally unsound. This combination of moral hypocrisy in its supply chain and reckless negligence in its financial stewardship set the stage for an inevitable explosion. The only question was who would light the fuse. The 2002 storm, the Hershey food sale, crisis and trust governance. By the turn of the 21st century, the Hershey Trust had become one of the most powerful and insular institutions in America. It was a $12 billion kingdom, a self-perpetuating charitable oligarchy accountable to almost no one. Its 17-member board of directors was a who's who of Pennsylvania's political and corporate elite. Many were lifers, appointed by their friends on the board, and they governed the town, the company, and the school with an air of impenetrable paternalistic authority. This board was the physical embodiment of Milton Hershey's dead hand, and it operated with a level of secrecy and privilege that was a throwback to the Gilded Age. But the world outside Hershey, Pennsylvania, had changed. The financial scandals of 2001 and 2002 had shattered public confidence. The names Enron and WorldCom had become bywords for corporate malfeasance, board-level negligence, and catastrophic conflicts of interest. In this new, deeply skeptical post-Enron atmosphere, the Hershey Trust's archaic structure looked less like a quaint legacy and more like a disaster waiting to happen. The Trust's entire $12 billion endowment was still overwhelmingly concentrated in a single asset, Hershey food stock. This was not just poor management in the eyes of modern financial fiduciaries. It was staggeringly reckless. The Columbia Law Review would later calculate the opportunity cost of this failure to diversify at $2.7 billion, a sum that could have funded countless scholarships or even a second school. Pressure had been mounting for years, both from outside financial experts and from a new, more corporate-minded faction within the trust itself. This new guard was led by Richard "Rick" Lenny, the CEO of Hershey Foods, who had been brought in to modernize the company. Lenny, along with board chair Robert Vowler, looked at the trust's portfolio and saw an unacceptable level of risk. What if a sudden health scare about chocolate, a catastrophic supply chain disruption, or a simple change in consumer taste sent the stock plummeting? The school's entire future was tethered to this single volatile commodity. Their argument was rational, logical, and purely financial. The trust must sell the company to fulfill its primary fiduciary duty, protecting the financial health of the Milton Hershey School. In July 2002, the board, in a secret vote, made its move. They announced they were exploring the full range of strategic alternatives, a corporate euphemism that sent a bolt of pure terror through the community. They intended to sell Hershey Foods. The board had hired Wall Street bankers, and the bids came in fast. The Wrigley Company of Chicago offered $12.5 billion. Global food giant Nestlé, Hershey's arch rival, was also a serious contender. The announcement was a declaration of war. To the board, this was a prudent financial transaction. To the people of Hershey, Pennsylvania, it was an existential betrayal. The board's logic was that their duty was to the orphan children. The town's passionate response was that Milton Hershey's legacy was the town, the community, and the company, not just a disembodied pile of cash. The potential buyers were not benevolent partners. They were competitors. Wrigley, a gum manufacturer, would have no use for Hershey's chocolate-making infrastructure. Layoffs would be immediate. Nestlé would almost certainly absorb the brand and gut the Pennsylvania operations to eliminate redundancies. The utopian dream would be auctioned off, dismantled, and shuttered, all by the very men entrusted to protect it. The public reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Critics, seizing on the financial climate of the time, branded the board's plan a charitable Enron. This was a board, they argued, acting in its own self-interest, preparing to cash out a century-old American icon and destroy the lives of 12,000 employees and their families, all under the guise of fiduciary duty. The town of Hershey, normally a quiet tourist destination, erupted in a popular revolt. The rebellion was not led by radical activists. It was led by high school football coaches, small business owners, retired factory workers, and most powerfully, the alumni of the Milton Hershey School. Green and white lawn signs bloomed across Derry Township. Hershey is not for sale. Save our town. Honor Milton's deed. Thousands of furious residents packed a high school auditorium, waving signs and screaming at the board members who dared to attend. The alumni, who owed their entire lives to the school, felt the most profound sense of betrayal. They saw the sale as a desecration of the home that had saved them. They organized, writing letters, holding press conferences, and arguing that the orphans the board claimed to be protecting were, in fact, the ones leading the charge against the sale. They argued that a diversified portfolio of index funds could never provide what the Hershey legacy did, a real-world connection to a tangible, inspiring, and job-creating enterprise. The fight quickly escalated from a local protest to a full-blown political crisis. The board had fatally miscalculated the political climate. This was not just any company, this was Hershey. It was a Pennsylvania institution, and 2002 was an election year. Leading the charge was Pennsylvania's Attorney General D. Michael Fisher, a Republican then running for governor. Fisher recognized the political and legal dynamite. As Attorney General, he held the ancient common law power of parens patriae, literally parent of the country. This doctrine designates the state's top lawyer as the ultimate protector of charitable interests, giving him the legal standing to intervene when a trust appears to be violating its mission. Fisher, backed by bipartisan outrage from across the state, filed a petition in court to stop the sale. The case landed in the one court that held ultimate jurisdiction over Milton Hershey's legacy, the Dauphin County Orphans Court. The name itself felt like a relic, a direct link back to the 1909 Deed of Trust. The legal battle was a clash of two worlds. The trust's high-priced lawyers from Philadelphia and New York argued the cold, hard logic of modern finance. This board has a legal duty to diversify. Failure to do so is negligence. Our duty is to maximize the value of the trust for the children, not to prop up a town or guarantee lifetime employment. Fisher's office, alongside lawyers for the alumni and the community, argued a case rooted in history and emotion. They presented Milton Hershey's own words, his deed of trust, as evidence. He didn't just create a fund. He created an interconnected system, a school, a town, a company. He intended for the boys to learn a trade and then work at that company. Selling the company, they argued, would irrevocably destroy the very fabric of Hershey's intent, even if it made the school richer on paper. On September 17, 2002, Judge Warren G. Morgan of the Orphans Court delivered his ruling. He sided with the Attorney General in the town, issuing an injunction to permanently block the sale. The courtroom erupted. The town of Hershey celebrated as if it had won a war. The board's plan was dead. The recriminations were swift and brutal. The board was humiliated, its authority shattered. The Attorney General, now holding all the cards, forced a massive purge. 7 of the 17 board members, the entire faction that had pushed for the sale, were forced to resign in disgrace. The court seized control, demanding a comprehensive reform of the trust's governance. A reform agreement was hammered out in late 2002, designed to shatter the insular, conflicting power structure that had allowed the crisis to happen. First, it explicitly outlawed the interlocking boards. No longer could a trustee of the Hershey Trust also serve on the board of the Hershey Company or Hershey Entertainment. This was designed to end the glaring conflict of interest where board members were, in effect, overseeing themselves. Second, it imposed term limits. Trustees would be limited to 2 5-year terms, ending the era of trustees for life. Third, it mandated new criteria for board members, requiring representation from individuals with actual experience in education and child welfare, not just political or corporate cronies. To oversee this new era, the court appointed a new board chairman, Leroy S. Zimmerman, himself a former Pennsylvania Attorney General. He was seen as a cleanup man, a steady hand to restore order. But the 2002 storm, for all its drama, had a deeply ironic postscript. The central problem that had triggered the crisis, the trust's massive, undiversified portfolio, was left unsolved. The court, by blocking the sale, had effectively forced the trust to remain undiversified, leaving it just as vulnerable as before. Furthermore, the reform agreement completely failed to address the other major criticism leveled at the trust, its hoarding. The trust was still spending only a tiny fraction of its wealth each year, far less than the 5% payout typically required of private foundations. Governance scandals and a culture of self-enrichment. The 2002 reforms had changed the faces at the table, but they created a new problem. Freed from the risk of public insurrection over selling the company, the new board, led by Zimmerman himself, allegedly began to treat the $17 billion endowment as a private slush fund. This ushered in one of the most disgraceful decades in the trust's history, dominated by what critics described as systemic self-enrichment, gross mismanagement, and blatant conflicts of interest, all while a disturbing pattern of internal abuse festered within the school itself. The man appointed by the court to lead this reform, Leroy S. Zimmerman, became a symbol of this new rot. As the former Attorney General, he was seen as an incorruptible reformer, yet he soon allegedly embraced the very culture of excess he was sent to dismantle. Zimmerman held seats on 3 different Hershey boards, the trust, the company, and the entertainment group, before the 2002 reforms fully prohibited it. Investigative reports from the Philadelphia Inquirer, most notably by journalist Bob Fernandez, revealed that in the 2009 to 2010 period, Zimmerman's compensation from these various board roles reached a staggering $500,000 a year. It was a level of compensation unheard of in the philanthropic world, a salary drawn from a fund meant to feed and clothe impoverished children. Zimmerman was not alone. The new board quickly populated itself with politically connected figures who drew lavish stipends. Former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge and former NFL star Lynn Swann were appointed to subsidiary boards, receiving substantial paychecks for what critics argued was minimal work. This cozy arrangement, where political influence seemed to be the primary qualification for stewarding a children's charity, created an atmosphere of entitlement. This culture of excess soon manifested in a series of bizarre and wasteful land deals. In 2006, the Trust, now under Zimmerman's leadership, approved the purchase of the Rendale Golf Course for $12 million. The problem, as the Philadelphia Inquirer later exposed, was that the property's own appraised value was millions less, estimated between $4 million and $5 million. The Trust had, for no clear reason, paid 2 to 3 times the course's market value. Further investigation revealed that the seller had close ties to board members. The Trust also spent millions acquiring properties like Pumpkin World, a local amusement park, under the vague justification of expanding the school, though these acquisitions looked more like vanity projects for the board. The conflicts of interest became blatant. Richard "Rick" Lenny, the CEO of the Hershey Company who had championed the 2002 sale, remained a powerful figure. He sat on the board of the Trust, the very entity that owned his company and set his compensation. He was, in effect, his own boss, a textbook violation of corporate governance principles. This alleged plundering of the Trust's assets finally triggered another investigation. In 2010, then Attorney General Tom Corbett, who was coincidentally running for governor, launched a probe into the board's compensation and land deals. The investigation, however, was seen by many critics as frustratingly lenient. In 2013, Corbett's office, now under his successor Kathleen Kane, finalized a new settlement. It imposed a cap on trustee pay, slashing it to a more reasonable $30,000 per year, with an additional $10,000 for the chair. But for many, this was too little, too late. The board members who had overseen the wasteful spending and collected the six-figure salaries were largely allowed to remain in place. The situation imploded again in 2016. Attorney General Kathleen Kane reopened the investigation, accusing the Trust of violating the 2013 agreement. Her office filed a petition in court alleging that the board was riddled with a culture of defiance and pervasive conflicts of interest. The court filings painted a damning portrait of a dysfunctional board at war with itself. It was revealed that the Trust had spent $4.2 million of the children's money not on education or welfare, but on internal investigations, PR firms, and lawyers to manage the board's own infighting. The rot was so deep that in the same year, John Estey, the former chief of staff to Governor Ed Rendell, himself another high-paid board member, was charged and later convicted of wire fraud for a separate kickback scheme, further cementing the public's perception of the Trust as a haven for political grifters. The sanctuary: abuse and discrimination. While the board was allegedly enriching itself, a far darker story was unfolding inside the walls of the Milton Hershey School. The institution, which publicly promoted itself as a nurturing, life-saving sanctuary, was facing a wave of lawsuits and complaints alleging a pattern of systemic discrimination, psychological abuse, and a shocking failure to protect its students. The most notorious case erupted in 2011. A mother from the Philadelphia area, identified in court records as Mother Smith, attempted to enroll her adolescent son, a promising student. The school accepted him. But during the final enrollment process, the boy's medical records revealed he was HIV positive. The school immediately, and in writing, rescinded its offer of admission. Its reasoning, stated in a cold administrative letter, was that the boy's presence would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of other students, and that the school was not equipped to manage his condition, citing the residential nature of the campus where students might engage in sexual behavior. The decision was a catastrophic misjudgment rooted in what the family's lawyers called 1980s-era bigotry. The AIDS Law Project of Pennsylvania took the case, which exploded into a national scandal. Medical experts and public health officials lined up to condemn the school, stating that HIV was not transmissible through casual contact and that the school's direct threat argument was medically baseless and deeply discriminatory. The school, with its multi-billion-dollar endowment and its own world-class medical center just down the road, was claiming it could not manage a condition that thousands of American families managed every day. The school's administration, led by President Anthony Callistra, doubled down, defending the decision in the press. The backlash was brutal. The Orphan Trust was now being portrayed as a bigoted institution, discriminating against a child precisely because of his medical vulnerability. The U.S. Department of Justice, under Attorney General Eric Holder, launched its own civil rights investigation. Facing a legal and public relations nightmare, the school finally capitulated in 2012. It settled the lawsuit with the family for $700,000 and agreed to pay a $15,000 civil penalty to the Department of Justice. More importantly, the school was forced to publicly reverse its policy and formally apologize, admitting its decision was a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The settlement from the Department of Justice explicitly stated that the school's direct threat defense was unfounded. This was not an isolated incident. Other lawsuits and complaints surfaced, alleging a pattern of discrimination against children with disabilities. One lawsuit alleged a student in a wheelchair was effectively segregated from his peers. Another, more troubling pattern emerged concerning mental health. A 2015 investigation by the advocacy group Protect the Hershey's Children, headed by alumnus Rick Fuad, accused the school of systematically weeding out students with depression or other mental health challenges, often expelling them and sending them back to the broken homes they were rescued from. This allegation gained horrifying traction with the 2013 suicide of Abby Bartels. Abby was a 13-year-old student who had been struggling with severe depression. Instead of providing her with comprehensive long-term care, the school allegedly expelled her, sending her back to her family. Days later, she took her own life. Her family filed a wrongful death lawsuit in 2016, alleging the school, with its vast resources, had a duty to protect her and that its rigid, punitive disciplinary policies were to blame for her death. The lawsuit, however, was later dismissed. The darkness was punctuated by the specter of sexual abuse. In 2008, William Charney Jr., a house parent at the school, a position of ultimate trust, was arrested. An investigation revealed he was in possession of over 700 images of child pornography. He was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. That same year, the Coons lawsuit was filed, alleging that another staff member had sexually abused at least 8 different students. The school, which was supposed to be a fortress protecting children from the world's dangers, was proving to have predators within its own walls. The $17 billion sanctuary was, for some, a place of profound danger, a kingdom unto itself in Pennsylvania. The largest and most indefensible sin of the Hershey Trust is a simple mathematical one: the hoarding of its wealth. Under IRS law, private foundations in the U.S. are required to spend a minimum of 5% of their assets annually on their charitable mission. This rule exists to prevent the wealthy from warehousing fortunes in tax-free entities indefinitely. But the Hershey Trust, due to its unique legal structure as a charitable trust and not a private foundation, is exempt from this 5% rule. And it has exploited that exemption to an astonishing degree. Financial analyses have repeatedly shown that the trust spends only about 1.5% to 2% of its endowment, roughly $259 million per year, on its core mission, the Milton Hershey School. If the $17.4 billion trust were forced to abide by the 5% rule, it would be legally obligated to spend over $850 million a year. This gap of nearly $600 million annually, money that is hoarded rather than spent, has led to the bitter viral slogan, "The richest school for the poorest kids." Critics argue that with that extra money, the trust could build dozens of new schools across the country or fund scholarships for tens of thousands of at-risk children. Instead, the $17.4 billion fortune just sits, compounding tax-free year after year. How can a charity publicly hoard such a vast fortune? The answer lies not in grand conspiracies, but in a cold political reality. The trust has allegedly turned the state of Pennsylvania into its personal fortress, using two primary weapons, economic power and political capture. The first weapon is sheer economic dominance. The Hershey Trust is not just a financial fund. It is the largest economic engine in central Pennsylvania. Its entities, from the Hershey Company, a Fortune 500 corporation, and the Hershey Entertainment and Resorts Complex, including Hershey Park, the Hotel Hershey, and the Giant Center Arena, to the Penn State Milton S. Hershey Medical Center, a top-tier hospital and medical school, are responsible for tens of thousands of jobs and billions in annual economic activity. This power creates a chilling effect on legislators in the state capital of Harrisburg. Any politician who dares challenge the trust by calling for an investigation, proposing laws to force more spending, or even just asking public questions, risks their entire career. They would be labeled an enemy of jobs, threatening the economic stability of an entire region. The pressure from constituents, unions, and local business leaders would be unbearable. The second, and perhaps more sinister weapon, is what critics call influence capture through a blatant political revolving door. The proof, they say, is right on the board's membership list. It is a roll call of the state's most powerful political insiders. Ed Rendell, the former governor of Pennsylvania and past chairman of the Democratic National Committee, sat on the board. Tom Corbett, another former governor, also sat on the board. But most critically, before becoming governor, Corbett was the state's attorney general, the very office whose sole legal duty is to oversee and regulate the Hershey Trust. Leroy S. Zimmerman, the man appointed to clean up the trust in 2002, was also a former attorney general. Even John Esty, the former chief of staff to Governor Rendell, who was later convicted of wire fraud, was an influential board member. This arrangement creates a systemic and undeniable conflict of interest. The Attorney General's office is the public's only watchdog. But how can that office aggressively investigate the trust when its former and potentially future bosses are sitting on that board, drawing its paychecks? The advocacy group Protect the Hershey's Children argues this is precisely the point. It neutralizes the regulator, turning the public's watchdog into a loyal house pet. This explains why state-level investigations, like the one Tom Corbett launched in 2010 while running for governor, or the 2013 settlement under Kathleen Kane, were criticized as light-touch reforms that failed to address the core problems of governance and spending. Protected by this political and economic shield, the board confidently defends its hoarding. Their official argument? They are simply obeying the founder's wish. Milton Hershey's deed of trust commanded them to preserve the corpus, the principle, of the trust in perpetuity. They claim as fiduciaries that they have a sacred duty to ensure the school exists forever, not just for 100 years, but for 1,000. They argue that spending 5% a year, like a private foundation, would be reckless, eroding the principle, and ultimately destroying Hershey's wish. Critics, however, including the famed philanthropic expert Pablo Eisenberg, have called this a cynical excuse for inaction. Eisenberg, one of the Trust's most vocal detractors, argued that the board's true motivation is not to protect the children, but to maintain its own power. A $17.4 billion trust gives its board members immense political and economic influence. They are kingmakers in Pennsylvania. A $5 billion trust that had spent down its assets would carry far less influence. Reformers like Eisenberg have long called for a radical solution: dissolve the current board and replace it with independent education and child welfare experts with no political ties to Pennsylvania. They also demand the complete legal separation of the nonprofit trust from the for-profit Hershey Company. Despite reforms in 2013 and 2016 that capped board pay, the fight continues. The 2024 lawsuit, Fuad v. Milton Hershey School Trust, led by the alumnus Rick Fuad, proves that the core disputes over governance and spending are far from over. This decades-long conflict has led many reformers to conclude that both the Dauphin County Orphans Court and the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office are compromised. They believe the only entity strong enough to break the political grip must be the federal government. Only the IRS, by challenging the trust's tax-exempt status, or the U.S. Department of Justice, they argue, has the power to step in and force the world's richest orphanage to finally commit its full fortune to the children. The dead hand, Milton. Hershey's story is a profound paradox. He was a man defined by failure who built an unimaginable success. He was a tough industrial capitalist who built a benevolent utopia. He was a philanthropist who gave his entire fortune to save children. Yet the structure he created is now tainted by accusations of discrimination and abuse. The tangible results of his life are undeniable. The Hershey Company remains an American icon. More importantly, the Milton Hershey School has, by many measures, worked. It has genuinely saved thousands of lives. It has taken children from unimaginable poverty and broken homes and given them a $139,000 per year education, housing, and medical care, an Ivy League level upbringing entirely for free. Its alumni include successful doctors, lawyers, and engineers who owe their futures to the school. This is the tangible success. But the deeper meaning of the Hershey story is a complex cautionary tale. It is a story about the power of the dead hand, a founder's intent carved in stone, attempting to control the future from beyond the grave. Milton Hershey tried to create a perfect closed system, a company that earns profits to fund a school, but the very rigidity of his structure, giving total ownership of the company to a single trust, created unforeseen consequences. It created an organization that became too rich, too powerful, and too insular to be held accountable. His intent was pure, to protect children, but the structure he built to achieve that intent became self-serving. The trust, designed to be the guardian, became an entity that prioritized its own financial health and the political power of its board over its core mission. It became a $17.4 billion bureaucracy focused on hoarding wealth rather than spending it. The decades-long struggle, from the 2002 sale crisis to the governance scandals to the current fight over hoarding, is not really about legal clauses. It is a fight for the soul of Milton Hershey. The final question remains: What did he truly want? Was it a company and a fund preserved in perpetuity as a golden monument? Or was it the thousands of poor children right now, the children he swore to treat as his own, who are waiting for the help his vast fortune could provide? The battle between a founder's rigid intent and the messy reality of the modern world continues. And in Hershey, Pennsylvania, the sweetest place on earth, that battle remains bitterly contested.